All set.
Hello, my name is Jessica Peterson, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's WED Talk, the next normal for global supply chains in a post-pandemic world. Before we kick off our WED Talk today, I would like to introduce the Director of Workforce and Economic Development for the County of Bucks, Billy Barnes. Thank you for joining us today, Billy.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everyone. As Jessica mentioned, I'm Billy Barnes, Executive Director of Workforce and Economic Development. On behalf of the Bucks County Workforce Development Board and the County of Bucks, I want to welcome everyone to WED Talks. We are approaching the first anniversary of this innovative webinar series, which launched in June 2021. Every WED Talk is based on the most relevant topics affecting employers, economic development, and workforce. Our expert speakers examine how workforce-related trends impact our communities at global, regional, and local levels. Today, our WED Talk is especially timely for us. The discussion will focus on Supply Chain 2025, reflect on COVID disruptions, and explore how China's changing role, logistics sector dynamics, and the Ukraine crisis will impact the future of post-pandemic supply chains. By joining our WED Talk today, you are ready to gain insight into practical strategies for business leaders to thrive in the next normal. Let's introduce our global supply chain expert who will lead today's discussion. Jessica?
Hi, I am pleased to introduce our WED Talk presenter, Mark Millar. Leveraging over 30 years of global business experience in B2B services, including executive roles at Excel Logistics, DHL, and UPS Supply Chain Solution, Mark advises industry leaders about tomorrow's greatest supply chain challenges and opportunities. He is one of Asia's foremost speakers, delivering knowledge that empowers business professionals to make better informed decisions. As a trusted advisor, Mark's impartial insights and strategic guidance enables companies to better understand and navigate the complexities of Asia's to optimize their supply chains, increase competitive advantage, and explore business opportunities. Mark is the author of Global Supply Chain Ecosystems, commissioned and published by Corgan Page of London. His book provides invaluable practical advice on developing supply chain strategies for competitive advantage in a complex, connected world. Mark is also a visiting lecturer at Hong Kong Poly University and has delivered guest lectures at KU Space, Georgia Tech in Atlanta, RMIT in Ho Chi Minh City, and SP Jain in Singapore and Dubai. Mark's commitment, passion, and active industry participation have earned him recognition in the China Supply Chain Top 20, the 2017 USA listing of Top's Pro to Know in Supply Chain, and in the 2015 list of Asia's top 50 influencers in supply chain and logistics. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for leading our discussion today.
Hi, thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Billy and the team at Bucks County for inviting me here this morning. I'm delighted to join the webinar and share my insights on the new normal for global supply chains in a post-pandemic world. It's increasingly obvious that yesterday's well-established supply chains have become progressively more vulnerable in today's increasingly volatile world. And I believe we're on the cusp of a thrilling new era for supply chain. The coronavirus has vividly exposed the profound interdependencies in today's global supply chain ecosystems and powerfully demonstrated the inherent risks and increased volatility in our complex connected world. So here's the roadmap for my talk this morning. First of all, I'm going to reflect on the COVID disruptions, then look at have an outlook of the next normal for supply chain and look at three key areas. One is China's changing role. The second is the tragic recent Ukraine crisis, which seems to be going on and on. Then I'll look at 4 key logistics sector dynamics that are particularly relevant going forward. And following that, I'll have a brief conclusion and finish up with 10 specific actions that business leaders may want to consider to help them thrive through this crisis into the post-pandemic world. So that's our agenda. And then after that, of course, we'll open up for your questions. So first of all, this COVID disruption has been massive. It's obviously global. It's impacting everybody's business and everybody's life. It's been long lasting than any previous supply chain disruption. And we're still in a period of some considerable volatility, even though worldwide we're approaching 12 billion vaccines have been administered. It's still a very volatile situation. And what the COVID pandemic resulted in was a massive imbalance between supply and demand, resulting in disequilibrium in the supply chain, which to a large extent is still causing many problems. On the supply side, there are a whole range of factors that constrained supply, all related to the COVID. So factory close downs, labor shortages, border closures, crunch on capacity for transport, and just general supply malaise and shortages. On the demand side, we initially had a slump in demand, but then astonishingly to quite a few people, instead of going into a global economic meltdown, there was a massive bounce back as people were trapped at home but still had disposable income to spend. And as people couldn't spend on the services sector, go to the cinema, go out driving in their cars, go on holidays, go to watch or play sports, it unlocked this shopping bonanza of a life at home and a life online, and purchasing online in order to fuel that life at home. So we had work at home, school at home, exercise at home, and that fueled a huge surge in demand for physical goods, home entertainment systems, gym equipment, homeschooling, home working activity, that then had a bullwhip effect on the supply chain that had previously slowed down. And that resulted in this disequilibrium where we don't have enough transport capacity to respond to the surge in demand for goods. So what we ended up with from a logistics perspective was a COVID-induced supply chain gridlock. This involved tens, if not in some cases, hundreds of container ships being parked at anchor outside container ports, awaiting the opportunity to come in and berth and discharge their cargo and load the next set of cargo. The collapse of passenger travel by air resulted in the airlines removing the majority of their fleets from service, which left a very limited air freight capacity to carry air cargo. What the airlines then did was, as you can see in this picture, they ended up putting cargo into passenger seats and strapping it in. And then many of them went one step further and removed the passenger seats so that they could load the whole passenger deck with cargo. This is still ongoing, certainly in the Asia region, where we're not quite through the COVID crisis yet, as we are in a lot of the West and North America and Europe. Now, this backlog of product and the congestion throughout the transport asset ecosystem resulted in a over demand for warehouse capacity. So we ended up with warehouses getting full of product that was either stored at the origin because either it couldn't get on the transport asset to move, or in many cases orders had been cancelled early on. And then at the destination, there was a backlog of distribution network capacity linked to the ability to transport goods that resulted in the warehouses becoming overflowing. And then the fourth key area of the logistics is how the trucking sector, which was already suffering from a shortage of truck drivers in most first world markets, then became further compounded by the fact that truckers, obviously, some of them caught COVID and got sick and couldn't go to work. In many cases, there were restrictions on what sort of work was allowed to be undertaken. And then, of course, there were some border closures, whether it was provincial borders or international borders, that meant trucks were unable to travel. This has exacerbated a pre-existing problem. The American Trucking Association reported that the shortage of truck drivers in the United States at the end of 2021 was 80,000. So that's 80,000 truck drivers that are missing from the ecosystem. And they project that if this current trend continues, by the year 2030, that number will be 160,000 truck driver shortage in the United States. So we have this COVID-induced supply chain gridlock that many parts of the world are coming through now, but it's not by any means totally clear. So on to the next aspect of this disruption is to look at the next normal for supply chain. So thinking going forward, how is this going to unfold? Well, I firmly believe that we're going to see a new era for supply chain in the next normal. And when we think through forward, companies are going to have to increase the resilience of their global supply chains and reduce these level of dependencies that have been so brutally exposed by the virus. And there are two enduring multi-year factors here, which mean that we cannot go back to the old model whenever this new normal arrives. And the first enduring factor is the geopolitical tensions between the major superpowers that have continued under the new United States leadership, I think to the surprise of many observers, in as almost as harsh a way as they were under the previous leadership. So this is an ongoing challenge, these geopolitical tensions and the trade wars between the United States and China. And the second enduring factor is, of course, the COVID pandemic. This is now into its third year. So I think as a result of these two enduring factors, globalization has become stalled, and it is inevitable that there will be some element of decoupling between the West and the East. And then when we think forward onto the potential decoupling and the stalling of the globalization, we come onto this discussion about the relocation of production. And these discussions have surfaced during supply chain disruption crises in the past, but this crisis has been much deeper and much more long-lasting. So the relocation of production discussions relate to the moving of sourcing and or production activities from Asia, from China, specifically back closer to the destination market, for example, into Latin America to serve the North American market, or in the European context to move it into Eastern Europe, maybe Hungary or Poland, to serve the Western European market. The other option is to go one step further, which is called reshoring or onshoring. And that's to move that production and sourcing activities back into the final destination market. So that would move it back into the United States and make it effectively a domestic supply chain instead of an international supply chain. And over the coming years, we're going to see some real movement in this area, which has been much talked about in the past. But this time, we will see some real action. Tim Cook, the chief executive of Apple, just said on the latest earnings call last week that the result of all this gridlock in the supply chain, and particularly the latest lockdown situation in China, which I'll be talking about shortly, is going to accelerate his initiatives to move some, not all, but some of his Apple manufacturing back home into the United States. Now, when we have these discussions about relocation of production back into a first world consumption market, inevitably the topic of the labor the availability thereof and the cost thereof is a big inhibitor to, or has been in the past, a big inhibitor to the reshoring of production. However, now compared to where we were 30 years ago when the great globalization shift commenced, it's very interesting to see on this chart from McKinsey how labor costs over that period of time have more than doubled, whilst the cost of robotics and automation solutions has more than halved. So when we're looking at the financial modeling of automation in production vis-a-vis manual labor in production, we're now looking at a completely different model. And therefore, I think this progress of robotics and the reduction of cost, combined with the increase in labor costs throughout the world, is going to provide a better opportunity for companies to seriously undertake reshoring of their production back home. Interesting to note, this next chart shows the comparison of labor rates based on a robot working across 2 shifts against the human labor rates. And you can see how the dimensions have changed over time, such that today, this is again is a McKinsey study, such that today the cost of human labor rates in the United States is a factor of 6 times more than operating a robot over 2 shifts. The other interesting aspect, and you can see the relative comparisons for Germany and China as well. The relative comparison is significant here because what we're talking about is robots that work throughout the shift. They don't need breaks, they don't need annual leave, they don't need sick leave. They operate around the clock effectively. And what this is telling us that even in China now, it can be 20% more cost effective to run an operation using automation and robotics than it is to use the labor. And in fact, the labor rate in China now has increased in recent years so much, it's now more expensive than the Mexico average labor rate. This is for factory workers. So this is the catalyst, I think. The catalyst is the COVID to reconfigure the supply chain and the automation availability and cost. And a lot of these solutions now are available on a service model. So the upfront capital expenditure is not required. It's operated on a pay-as-you-use service model. Certainly opens the gates for some real action on nearshoring and onshoring. And so what we will see going forward through to supply chain 2025 is that supply chains become much less global. They'll become much more regional, and therefore they will be shorter and more localized. And the business benefits from that is we can reduce our lead times, reduce our freight costs, and reduce emissions, which is good for the world, whilst we increase our control and increase our responsiveness and increase our overall resilience. Now, when we undertake that, we have to think about the next key topic on here, which is China's changing role. So let's explore a little bit about that. China's role is changing both at home and abroad in quite significant directions. First of all, at home, there are 2 major initiatives underway by the Chinese Communist Party. The first is called dual circulation. And this is to try and continue to stimulate the domestic consumption, but also to increase the proportion of the goods that are consumed domestically, increase the proportion that are produced domestically. So to increase domestic production to serve domestic consumption. At the same time as what they call the international circulation, which is to continue to expand the juggernaut of Chinese exports that has been all before us in the last 20 years. There's an element here of wanting to become a little bit more self-sufficient, reduce the amount of imports, and particularly anything to do with the technology sector. They are very, very keen to develop at-home domestic capabilities wherever they can. The second initiative at home in China is called Common Prosperity. And this initiative is designed to effectively increase the share of the pie across the whole population. A type of leveling up strategy where over the recent years, everybody has become better off, but quite a few people have become more better off substantially than others. It's trying to balance out the economic prosperity in a more equitable way across the population. And then abroad on the international stage, China has become much more vocal, much more prominent, and in many ways, people perceive it to be much more argumentative. This has been christened the wolf warrior diplomacy, and we get the respective government spokespeople talking about what's the Western world is doing vis-a-vis the China perspective and the China philosophy. And at the other angle of the China strategy abroad, we have this Belt and Road Initiative. This is number 4 on the slide here. And this shows in red the amount of countries. 139 countries have now become involved in Belt and Road initiatives. This is largely developing infrastructure, so telecommunications infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, tunnels, ports, airports, major infrastructure projects, some $4 trillion worth thus far. This initiative's been going less than 10 years across these countries, which, as you can see from the chart, are predominantly emerging or developing market economies. So this is, there's a lot of sort of mystery about the Belt and Road Initiative and questions about transparency and debt financing, but it's an extension of China's reach around the world through the mechanism of infrastructure investments. Now, when it comes to thinking about China and the diversification of supply chains and the potential relocation of production, we've got to think, well, first of all, there's no way that all of the production that's made in China can now be relocated somewhere else. That's just not possible. But there are some movements, as I've alluded to. A Gartner survey recently identified that 33% of their clients will have moved or are planning to have moved production, some production, out of China by 2023. And really, from a China supply chain strategy, there's 3 real alternatives. One is what's called the China Plus, and this is to move some of the manufacturing out of China, typically to somewhere else in the Asia region. And this had a major stimulus when the tariffs, the US tariffs on China origin imports were introduced. So what happened then was a lot of production was moved, US destined production was moved out of China into adjacent Asian markets that have relatively low cost labor forces. Vietnam was a key beneficiary of this, but also places like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Thailand, and Indonesia to some extent. So that's the China Plus, is having an additional manufacturing location outside of China, generally speaking, still in the low-cost Asia region. The second strategy is what I just talked about, is the nearshoring or reshoring. So this is not just moving it somewhere else in Asia, this is nearshoring it towards home. Mexico is the #1 candidate for all these types of activities to serve the US market, or in the European case, into Eastern Europe. And we're seeing some initiatives of that underway already. The thing about these initiatives, you would not necessarily pre-announce them. And the other thing that's key is that these reconfiguring of supply chains, generally speaking, is a multi-year project. It's not something you flick a switch and it's done by the end of the week. So there's the China Plus option, there's the nearshoring, reshoring option, And then the third option is the in China for China option. And that is to say that many multinational companies that are selling into the domestic China market, there would be no point. In fact, it would be detrimental for them to move their production out of China, not just from a practical perspective, but also from a political perspective. So what we sell in China, we will make in China, is generally the approach. What we make in China and export elsewhere, we will look at alternative supply chain solutions for that. And we mustn't forget that China is now one of the world's biggest consumption markets. And the interesting factor in this whole globalization journey that I've been involved with for the last 25 years is that 25 years ago, the multinational companies, they went to China for the workers. And here we are 25 years later, and those same multinational companies are staying in China for the shoppers, because the investment, the foreign direct investment and the low-cost manufacturing has generated such a massive consumption market that we want to sell to these shoppers who are also the workers. So that's the sort of China angle. Now, what's happened just in the last couple of months that's causing a lot of concern on the global stage as it pertains to availability of product and supply chains is we've seen the Omicron variant of the virus seep into the Chinese mainland despite the very strict border controls. And China's still adopting this dynamic zero COVID policy, which means when the virus gets in and they have a relatively small number of cases, less than 100 in most cases, it will trigger a full lockdown even in a major city. This is the Bund in Shanghai, population around 23 million people is the population of Shanghai. And that was under a strict lockdown for the best part of a month, despite the COVID cases being less than 500. So this is very stern approach. And of course, this has economic impact as well as the impact on people's lives. But from a supply chain perspective, has an economic impact. The world's busiest container port is in Shanghai. The third biggest cargo airport is in Shanghai. And whilst these lockdowns were in place, workers could not go to work. And so we had ships queuing up outside that could not discharge, come into berth to discharge or to collect to take exports out. And this has had as I said, big ramifications on global supply chains. These two charts here show the extent of it. Just 2 weeks ago, on April the 28th, this left-hand chart shows the number of ships, green is cargo ships, container ships, that are outside of Shanghai port, the world's biggest container port, waiting to get in, to berth, to discharge and reload cargo. And the chart on the right-hand side is the Purchasing Managers Index, known as the PMI. This is a measure used in many economies around the world, where above 50 indicates growth and below 50 represents slowdown. And here we can see how the China PMI has been hovering around 50 and now has reduced to less than 50 and is contracting for the last 3 months. So that represents concern both for supply chain leaders, but also for investors about the impact on the Chinese economy. Okay, well, enough about China for the moment. We've got another crisis that is tragic from a humanitarian perspective, which I won't go into because I'm talking about supply chains, but has big ramifications from a supply chain perspective. This crisis in between Russia and Ukraine is having a huge impact. So key areas that are involved from a business and supply chain perspective. We have supply constraints of products, particularly raw materials and cereal products that cannot be either cannot be exported or have been sanctioned from being purchased. Ukraine supplies 15% of the global grain supply, and Russia exports over $6 billion of wheat per year. Now, right now, there are 4.5 million tons of grain in Ukraine ready to be exported that cannot be moved out. And sooner or later, this is going to have ramification on the world supply for bread and cereals and basic food stocks. There are also some key minerals and metals that both these countries are a key part of the global supply chain for. And with these transport blockages of getting in and out, these products are not going to be able to move. The sanctions, which this chart points out quite neatly, are predominantly Western-led, so it's North America, Western Europe, plus Japan and Australia have signed up for these very severe, unprecedented level of severity of sanctions on Russia business, Russia enterprises, Russian leadership, etc. And that is going to permeate through business and supply chains. Many companies are not going to be able to continue business as they have done. And then, of course, the airspace is off limits, so that disrupts intercontinental air traffic, both people movement and the movement of goods. And the Black Sea ports are pretty much effectively closed. And then what was interesting is that during the COVID crisis, as the container shipping ran out of capacity, more and more goods were traveling on the Silk Road, which this chart shows between China and Europe. More than 1 million additional containers traveled on this Silk Road last year compared to previous years because of the tightness of capacity in ocean shipping. And of course, these land routes through Russia are now closed, but there's no ship capacity for that additional 1 million containers to find to be transported. So another massive disruption on top of what was already a pretty chaotic global supply chain scenario. And this survey from AlixPartners just last month identified that at the CEO level, the supply chain is the biggest issue for business leaders, along with these other two things about the IT systems and the workers. So I believe that this whole scenario that we've seen for the last 2 or 3 years is what I call another nail in the coffin for globalization. And I think in 5 to 10 years' time, when we look at the globalization of business, we'll see definitely a slow down, we'll see a reversal and a pretty dramatic reconfiguration of global supply chains. So let's go on to look at the logistics sector dynamics. Of course, logistics is what underpins these global supply chains and therefore enables trade and business to happen. 4 key dynamics I want to share with you today. The first of these is what we call modal shifts. And this is whereby goods that, for example, used to travel on a ship will now travel on a plane. Goods that used to travel by a ship might travel on road, and goods that used to travel on road may change to rail or may change to ship. So this is effectively the freight forwarders and the logistics companies on behalf of their customers trying to rebalance the dynamics of how products are moved in order to just find a way through. So A to B doesn't necessarily go from A to B anymore. It goes through several other intermediate locations in order to get to its final destination. And of course, every mode of transport has been impacted, as I mentioned earlier, has been impacted by the COVID crisis and the latest Ukraine crisis. The second area is this e-commerce. This was an area that was pre-existing but became super accelerated by the COVID crisis, with everybody going online at home and shopping online. There are now more than 2.1 billion people doing online shopping. Last year, they spent almost $5 trillion US, and that generated 157.9 parcels to be shipped around to deliver these products that had been ordered online. Almost over half of all e-commerce now is what we call cross-border. So this is customers shopping online in one country and purchasing products from another country through the convenience of the internet, which of course then generates an international shipment in order for that product to be delivered. Those numbers in terms of both the spending and the volume of parcels are projected to increase by at least 50% by 2025. That'll take it to almost $7.5 trillion and 240 to 250 billion parcels a year. The current parcel volume around the world, floating around the world, is about 5,000 parcels per second. The third area of the key logistics sector dynamics is digitalization. Again, turbocharged by the COVID crisis. And we're seeing digitalization and robotics adopted quite widely, particularly in the warehouses, but we're also seeing it in the trucking fleets where autonomous vehicles are becoming more and more readily available from a technological perspective. We just don't necessarily have the legal and societal frameworks around having trucks and indeed cars moving around the transport system without anybody in charge at the wheel. I think as a society, we're not quite ready for that yet, but also from the legal framework and the insurance community, it's still a bit of a grey area from the regulatory perspective. But the technology is already there and available, as we know. And then the fourth area in the key logistics sector dynamics is further consolidation. Again, accelerated by the COVID crisis, where companies have wanted to get a bigger slice of the pie of the overall supply chain. So we're seeing shipping lines get involved in acquiring logistics companies. We're getting container port terminal operators getting involved in buying logistics companies. We've seen the biggest shipping line, Maersk Line, start up its own air cargo business with the initial chartering of 5 airplanes. So there's further consolidation going on in the sector, whereas the big guys are going to get even more bigger and dominant on the global supply chain stage. So to run through some brief conclusion, and then this 10 key actions that I've identified for us to consider going forward with our business. As we go towards this new normal, there are 4 key strategic priorities applicable to the post-pandemic world. And these apply to both supply chain leaders, but also business leaders and the executives in the C-suite. The first one, and this has been brutally exposed by the crisis and all other things going on, the first one is resilience. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversity. And particularly as it pertains to global supply chains, companies now certainly have to take major initiatives to improve the resilience of their supply chains through some of the initiatives I've already mentioned. The second one is the sustainability. Now, this has slipped down the priority list in recent months because there have become more pressing issues in terms of relation to business survival. But sustainability in the new normal is going to resurface back up the charts. And this is not just for business and government. Consumers are playing a massive role in this now. A survey from IBM said that 8 out of 10 consumers say that sustainability is an important factor in their purchasing decisions. This is consumers. And 6 out of 10 would be willing to change their shopping habits in order to reduce environmental impact. And the pandemic has deepened consumers' sense of responsibility about the environment. The third key strategic priority going forward to the next normal is going to be digitalization. Again, turbocharged by the COVID scenario. Everybody is now more familiar with online shopping than they were 2 years ago. But digitalization expands across the full business spectrum. So not just in the logistics aspects, but throughout all aspects of our businesses, there are opportunities to further digitalize and get on that journey. And then connecting all this together is the visibility dimension. Again, exposed by the COVID pandemic is the lack of visibility companies had through their supply chains. A McKinsey survey last year identified significant blind spots, as they call it, where only 48% of respondents claim to have a good understanding of their first-tier suppliers, and only 21% claim to have a good understanding of visibility into their second-tier suppliers. So when you don't have visibility, you get unexpected problems when issues arise, and that has been proven many times over as it relates to the supply chain disruptions. So let's have a look at 10 actions that business leaders and employers may wish to consider as we approach this new normal. First of all is what I call the weakest link. This is the find and fix approach to continually look for the weakest link in your supply chain or in your business, in your extended business ecosystem, is to find it and fix it. But once you strengthen the weakest link, it is obviously no longer the weakest link. And continually doing this is a pathway to continuous improvement. Secondly is to think about closer to home. This is, I think, a reflection of the fact that we have over-globalized. Everybody's been on this globalization bandwagon. And if we think about just bringing some things closer to home, we'll get more simpler supply chains. And of course, we would therefore get better visibility and more responsiveness to local demand. We can then think about the next one, which is the age of just-in-time has again been exposed by the supply chain disruption. Maybe it's time to rethink just-in-time and think about just-in-case. We could see a different approach to inventory emerging, where we go back to having buffer stocks and safety inventory levels. Fourthly is to think about logistics resilience. Are you working with the right logistics partner? Have they been responding to your needs through this huge global supply chain disruption? How do you feel about how they've been helping you? And is it time to rethink who you are working with from a logistics partner perspective? And then on the metrics and analytics side of it, I think it's an opportunity to rethink, are we really looking at the right metrics? Are we measuring and looking at the correct, most appropriate analytics? Businesses tend to, over a period of time, measure too much, and you have too much measurement going on and not enough analysis of the key performance metrics. So this is probably an opportunity to rethink the metrics that we're using in our business. Visibility, I've mentioned a couple of times already. How can we increase our visibility and therefore reduce the amount of unexpected occurrences? And going with closer to home and increasing visibility, if we can simplify our business, simplify our supply chains, everything will become a lot less vulnerable and a lot less volatile. Process productivity is to think about, again, in businesses over a period of time. In my experience in the corporate world, we tend to become encumbered with excessive amount of processes. So an approach we could take to think about process productivity is to think about, can we eliminate this process? If not, can we automate this process? And also, how can we accelerate the process? So eliminate, automate, and accelerate from a process productivity perspective. And I think in the modern world, number 9 here is about how prepared we are. I think now it's not about our ability to predict what is going to happen next, because things that have happened in the last 3 years were effectively black swan events that weren't predictable. So it's not about predicting, it's about being prepared. What is our level of preparedness for the next black swan event? We don't know what it is or where it's going to happen, but how prepared are we for another major global crisis? And then I think item 10 is, what is the cost of doing nothing? If we do nothing to change our business as a result of what we've been through in the last 2 years, what is the cost of that if we're not going to adapt and change? So a brief recap before I conclude. So what I've looked at in this session is reflected on the COVID disruptions, looked at the next normal for supply chain, thinking through to 2025, some of the changes that may be happening that you may want to consider, specifically looking into China's changing role, both home and abroad, and the 3 different supply chain strategies as it relates to China. Commenting on the Ukraine crisis and how this is going to be another global disruption as far as supply chains go. Looking at the 4 key dynamics in the logistics sector, the modal shifts, the e-commerce frenzy, the digitalization initiative, and the further M&A consolidation. And then having a conclusion about these 4 strategic priorities going forward. That's the resilience, the sustainability, the digitalization again, and the visibility, and then 10 key actions that you might want to consider. So I think in conclusion, to wrap up, it's thinking about these 4 key strategic priorities. What could you be doing? Whether it's in your business life, your professional life, or indeed in your personal life. What could you be doing to increase your resilience, to enhance your sustainability, to improve your digital fitness, and to expand your visibility? Because at the end of the day, it's going to come down to you. So thank you, Billy, and I'll hand back for questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great presentation. We will entertain questions and answers right now. You can put the questions in the questions feature in your control panel. I do see a question that came through. Just give me a moment here. Okay, Mark. Question, from a global perspective, what are the ramifications of the diversification of the supply chain away from China have on the U.S. Treasury market, given China is the largest holder of the U.S. debt, that may lead to China selling its holdings, therefore higher rates and inflation in the U.S. and globally? Question mark. Short-term event?
Yes. Well, this is the challenge, right? The world economy is so inextricably linked with China, and that has developed over the last 30 years, that unplugging anything is going to have some ramifications and repercussions. So I think we would see some sort of short-term, as you say, short-term event, or some sort of shift that would have to be very carefully managed, of course. And I think this is why we can't have a total decoupling. And I said there would be an element of some decoupling, and indeed there would be impact on the investment markets and the treasury side on both parts of the aisle, as it were. So I think that's going to have to be handled quite carefully, obviously, but there will have to be some short-term shifts, yes.
Thank you, Mark. I don't see any other questions. We'll give it about another minute. If anybody wants to type a question, please do so in your control panel. Mark, were there any final thoughts while we're waiting for any other questions to come in?
Well, I'll just expand a little bit on this approach to the dynamic zero COVID policy in China, which is, as I alluded to earlier, the lockdowns that have taken place, particularly in Shanghai, the commercial capital, the business capital of China, have spooked a lot of investors, as well as obviously having disruptive impact on the supply chain. Some of you may be aware that every 5 years the Chinese Communist Party has its big gathering, and the 20th gathering, i.e. 100 years, is coming up later this year. And this is when Xi Jinping, who will have completed 2 5-year terms, this is when he is expected to get re-elected for a 3rd term, which is unprecedented. It's never happened before. And this is part of the reason why they have to maintain such a tight control on anything getting out of hand and out of control as it relates to the pandemic, in a society where they have a large proportion of their elderly people are unvaccinated, coupled with the fact that the people that have been vaccinated with the Sinovac, the Chinese homemade vaccine, that vaccine has a lower efficacy rate than the mRNA vaccines used in most places around the world. So they are vulnerable to a widespread outbreak of COVID, even the Omicron, could have quite a devastating effect on society, and that would result in unbalancing, if you like, the situation that they have coming into this key re-election in the autumn period. So the dynamic COVID, and I see a lot of reports from around the world, it doesn't make sense, it's not sustainable. The WHO have now started to question it. That is going to remain in place until the last quarter of the year, once this re-election process has gone. So it's not necessarily scientific, but that's the way it is. That's the explanation behind why it is such so severe, and how they have the resources and the will, if you like, and the mechanisms to be able to lock down a city of 23 million people. There's no other country in the world would be able to do that. So that's going to be in place through to the back end of this year, and with all the ramifications that it has, not just for the people there that are suffering through the lockdowns, but on the global supply and the global supply chains and the shipping and the air freight and the travel restrictions that have been in place. In my home, Hong Kong, the borders of Hong Kong, as international a city it is, the most international city of the whole China scenario, they only just last week opened the borders to international visitors who are not Hong Kong residents. So the borders have been closed for 2 years to non-residents and non-citizens. And that scenario of the border closures to foreigners is largely still in place in China and will be through to the end of the year. There are obviously some bypass mechanisms available for certain approved people that can come in and out. Of course, political leaders and some business leaders can get exceptions. So it's not going away anytime soon, no matter what we think about it and whether it makes sense or not. That's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be through to the fourth quarter. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mark. We don't see any other questions at this time. Jessica, I believe, has some closing remarks as well for the Workforce Development Board.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Please save the date for our next WED Talk on Wednesday, June 8th, entitled Managing Multiple Priorities in a Hybrid Work Environment. Top management trainer and author Eric Papp will discuss how to adopt actionable strategies for generating momentum on projects, accomplishing what matters most, and maintaining a work-life balance while navigating a hybrid work environment. Registration for this WED Talk will arrive through email soon. Don't miss it.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.